Tonight is Wednesday night, and tonight and obviously tomorrow is Shivos Tammuz, which is a fast day. And Shivos Tammuz, many things happened, obviously, which were considerably tragic to the Jewish people. One of the things that happened, obviously, was that they breached the walls of Jerusalem, and ultimately on Tisha B'Av it was destroyed. Either by the Babylonians, Tisha B'Av, or by the Romans, the second Beis Hamikdash, second temple, and so on, you know. But Shivas Tammuz is in many ways a tragic day, as I said, for the Jewish people. In fact, I'll tell you something which is very interesting. Tonight's Shir, by the way, is not about Shivas Tammuz, but I did want to mention a couple of ideas, especially as we will see, as it relates to America, which it does. Very significant. But the two greatest days in the year that represent the two greatest two greatest tragedies in the history of mankind really occurred on Rosh Hashanah, which is the first day of the year, and also Shivas Tammuz, the 17th day of Tammuz. Now you may say to me, that's incredible. Why is that so? And the answer to that is because on both days, the ability of somebody to be the Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David was destroyed. On Rosh Hashanah we know Adam Harishon would have been a Mashiach had he not sinned, you know, and not eaten from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. We know he would have been the Mashiach. However, since he ate from the tree, obviously he wasn't. He didn't become that. So that clearly is the greatest day in terms of tragedy of the Jewish people. So people don't realize that. That the day of Rosh Hashanah, which is the first day of Tishrei, you see, was the first day, and it was the greatest tragedy in the history of the world, because it meant that the Mashiach would not come, and therefore there would be no redemption. The second greatest tragic day is Shivas Tammuz. Why? Because one of the things that occurred on Shivas Tammuz is Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain. He saw the Jewish people worshiping the golden calf, the Chet Egel, and he threw the luchos, Rishonis, he threw the first tablets down to the bottom of the mountain, and they shattered. Now that was the second greatest tragic day in the history of man, because Moshe Rabbeinu should have been Mashiach ben Yosef. Had the Jews not sinned on that day, he would have been the Mashiach ben Yosef. And that would have ended the tikkun process, basically. And he, like being the Mashiach, that would have been the Geula, that would have been the redemption. You see? So those 2 days, Rosh Hashanah, by the fall of man, Adam Harishon, first man, and by the fall of the Jewish people, so to speak, and Moshe Rabbeinu could not be the Mashiach, the redemption at both times was foiled, was made impossible. And therefore both of these days are the greatest days, tragic days. In any case, today is Shivas Tammuz, and it is very much connected, as we will see, to what's happening in America. And today's shir is really about the American exile, because believe it or not, we are in Golus, and America is a Golus, and I want to talk about that, and the possible, how it could end, how the Golus in America could end, which I think is a very important concept to the Jewish people. I'm going to start the shir off by asking 3 questions. The first question is, we know that in this year there are 2 events which occurred in America, which in many ways are catastrophic. The first event was the pandemic, which of course we all know what that does. It shut down the American economy. And not only that, how many people suffered from it, how many lives were lost. And America is still suffering from it because in certain we have not gotten over the pandemic, you see. But what it has also done is it has erased the achievements of Trump. Trump has accomplished tremendous achievements, we know that, without going into that. And many of them which he has accomplished are historical in terms of unemployment, the amount of jobs, and the removal of bureaucracy and regulations, and the oil independence. There's so many things that he's done which are in many ways remarkable. But what the pandemic has done is brought the entire achievement of Trump to a halt. That's the first thing. The second catastrophic event in America has been an unsurpassed race riots. It's just incredible what happened. Tragically, George Floyd was murdered. That's really what happened. And what happened is that there were riots, murders, arson, looting, chaos, and so on, that has erupted across the American landscape, you see. And that obviously, what that has done is that it seems to have given tremendous power to the liberal Democrats. A tremendous amount of recognition and power and so on to the, like I said, the radical left, liberal Democrats, and the liberals in general and so on, both of which, of course, is again against Trump, because it has tremendously empowered them to defy Trump and to offer a very serious threat to his re-election campaign. So the question is, that's interesting. Why would the Rebbeinu Shem do that? Why didn't he make these things happen after he was elected? And after he was elected, well, it happened, you know, but his election is not threatened at all because it would be after his election and he's into a second term. So there's no concern, you know, that he won't have a second term. Now everybody's wondering what is going to happen. So the question is, why did Rebbeinu Shem do that? Why did he allow it to happen, you see, before the November 3rd election? Second question is, there's a well-known Rabbi Volozhin who was the greatest student or Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. And when questioned about America, he is said to have said, it is said that he says that America is the last galut, golus. It is the last exile of the Jews. In other words, this is the last stop. Now, clearly what that means is two ideas. One is that America is a golus. It is an exile. It is among the exiles that the Jewish people have to go through. And the second idea which we can glean from this is that it is the last exile, which means that the redemption will happen after the American exile will be over, because that's what it also means. Every exile in the end will end, we know that. So therefore, America, which is the last exile, according to Rabbi Volozhin, since it's the last exile, what that means is that right after that is the redemption, which is the arrival of the Mashiach. So what does Rabbi Volozhin mean? You know, in a certain sense, not how did he know, but what's the significance of what he said based on the divine agenda? That is the question I want to ask. So I'd like to begin, like I said, we're talking about the concept of golus, exile. So I'd like to talk about what exactly is golus. And I think it's very profitable for us to understand what it is that we struggle with. What is it? What is the definitive concept of golus? Now I'm going to be brief. I'm not going to go at at length explaining this. But if you recall, Adam Harishon, the first man, he was commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Fine. Now, what was important then, what was his job, so to speak? What was his task? His task basically was to avoid evil. His task was to avoid going against the will of God, merely to avoid it. And what that means is that the Satan who was offering that tremendous argument, temptation, what the Satan was saying, in the form of the Nachash, which is a snake, that was the mouthpiece of the Satan. And he was saying, of course, to Chava and to Adam, please eat from the tree because it will make you like God. And that's what the Satan was offering. But the Satan had no power over man's body, because Adam Rishon was in a dimension which was far beyond the ability of the Satan to in any way influence the body of Adam. But he could offer an argument. You see. So therefore, what Adam's job basically is to avoid the temptations of the Satan, and not to eat from that tree, which is the will of God. If he had done that, then he would have allowed Kedusha, enormous amount of Kedusha, holiness, to enter the world. That's called Hispashtus Kedusha. It's called the proliferation of holiness. And that was his job. And his achievement would have been to bring down tremendous amount of holiness, and that would have ushered in a messianic era. And he could have, of course, if he would have held out until the evening, let's say 6 p.m., which of course was Friday, then he would have been the Mashiach, and that would have ushered in the redemption itself. So his job basically was to avoid the temptations of evil, and that would bring an enormous amount of Kedusha, of holiness. That's called Hispashtus Kedusha. Now we know he failed. So when he failed, there's something radical that happened. What happened is that Adam fell from his lofty place in Gan Eden, where the Satan had no power in terms of the body of Adam. What happened is he empowered the Satan to become much greater. And therefore Adam, so to speak, fell into a different dimension of reality in which the Satan has rule. It's called Zoyamah, which means contamination, you see, or defilement. So Adam was in a dimension of reality that did not have that defilement of the Satan. However, after he sinned, he fell into that dimension, which is called Olam Asiyah, the world of action. And in that world, the Satan has tremendous amount of influence because he can project. That's what he does. He can project his energy, his defilement, you see. So therefore, the body of man became subject to the defilement or the contamination of this thing called Zoyamah, which is a projection or a product of the Satan's being in and of itself, you see. As such, he was then subject to death, because the essential nature of the Zoyamah is what's called decomposition. And what that means is that anything that the Satan has that type of influence over will decompose. And that is why all living matter decomposes, because we are in Olam Asiyah, and that is the dimension in which the Satan rules. And as a result of that, everything decomposes ultimately, you see. So therefore, the task of man no longer was just to avoid evil and bring in holiness. The task of man now was to deal with the Zoyamah, you see, to deal and to rid himself of this satanic influence on the physical body. And that became the new task of man after the fall of Adam Rishon. And that continued. But what was interesting is that if a person did do that, and the way to do that, of course, is to withstand the temptations of the Satan in this world, then he also would bring down he would withstand the temptations. The Satan's ability to influence a person would be enormously weakened, and that person would bring down ultimate Kedusha or holiness, and he could do it fully. Man had the full potential to activate what he could have become. You see, so that avodah is called kfir sarah, to subjugate or to subdue evil. You see, and as a result of that, also to bring holiness into the world. And at that point in time, he could fully enjoy the realization of his complete potential. This is the concept, of course, of kfir sarah, to subdue evil. Now we begin to see, therefore, that in the beginning, the obstacle of man wasn't that he can't fulfill his potential, but to avoid becoming ensnared in the advice of the Sultan. The second aspect of man's task is to avoid actually the satanic urges that every person has. Because the Sultan now has influence over your body, then all the urges and drives that you have basically are, the origin of that is satanic, you see. But he could fight that in a sense, and he could also achieve a tremendous amount or his full potential of holiness if he had done that. But at that already, the obstacle is to fight the actual satanic urges that a person has in his body. We now carry around a snake in our mind, in our psyche, you see. And that already, the obstacle is the zoyama itself, you see. Now, the third area of man is different, or the third avoid of man. And that's where a person has to struggle with zoyama, which is unbelievably unleashed, you see. And there are tremendous obstacles to overcome in this way. And there we begin to see the concept of golus, which is what? Exile, which is where a person now has to contend with enormous obstacles and forces, you see, in order to achieve some aspect of holiness. Therefore, what we begin to realize, but the interesting thing about it is that in that stage of avodah, or the task of man, you see, he cannot reach his full potential. The main idea in that era, or in that stage, is what is called a struggle. Man struggles, and he does achieve, but it can never be the achievement that he could have accomplished before, or rather in the second stage, when he could have fully achieved what he would have wanted to do, and so on, after he would be fighting the satanic influence. So that third stage is that a person is not merely exiled from a place. We think that exile is, well, we're not in our place. We're not in Israel, we're not in Eretz Israel, right? And we no longer have the Beis HaMikdash, as the enormous amount of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, being in Eretz Israel. So we're exiled from our place, which is Eretz Israel. No. The concept of Golus is much worse, because the concept of Golus is that we are exiled from ourselves. We cannot even be what we could be. This is the problem. We are so caught up in the Zoyama. It is so enormously intensified that basically our task is to struggle, to try to achieve. But how many of us struggle? Years go by and we hardly move toward Kedusha, toward holiness, you see. So what Golus is, and that's one of the great tragedies of the exile, is that we are displaced from ourselves. We are displaced from our potential to be actualized. And this, in many ways, is the third aspect of Avodah, is the third idea. It's the most difficult struggle of all, and it has been going on for thousands of years, you see. Certainly for the last 2,000 years, but actually since the destruction of the first temple, it has been going on. Well, we struggle to be what we can be. It's an interesting statement. I think it's from the army. They try to get you to join the army, so what they say is, be all you can be, And that statement really was true in the second level of Avodah. But in the third level of Avodah, the third task and so on, is that most of our actions are really struggles. We hardly achieve, and even if we do achieve, You see, it takes years and years, you see, but it's never to the fullest extent of what we could have been. Much harder. And of course, all of this is a result of the sin of the Jewish people. They sin, unfortunately, constantly, and therefore the Zoyama grows in strength. So therefore, what are we looking at? We're looking at three concepts or three stages of the avodah, of the task of man. You see, where do we see this? You know, it's interesting. There's a Gemara, I think it's in Sukkah, where the Gemara says that Hillel had 80 students. Some of the students were so great that they could have the divine presence rest on them, like Moshe Rabbeinu. Could you imagine that? Some of the students could stop the sun in its path, like Yehoshua, when he was engaged in a war, he said the sun to stop so it wouldn't become nightfall. You see, could you imagine that? So the question is, why couldn't they? And the answer is because because the generation wasn't worthy to have that type of people. You see, in other words, they could not actualize their full potential. Because obviously if the divine presence rests on you, that means that you have a tremendous amount of achievement that you've done, and with the divine presence resting on you, you become greater even. And that it becomes a lack of achievement when the divine presence does not rest on you. And the reason for that is because that is the third stage of man, of the Jew, that he cannot achieve what his potential allows him. This will all be solved or ended in the Messianic era, where every Jew will be able to access unbelievable holiness with incredible ease. No difficulty. You see, why? Because there's no Zoyama anymore. Mashiach ben David will have destroyed, or in whatever, altered the character of the Sultan. It's an argument, whatever. So there is no more Zoyama. And as a result of that, you can now access holiness with unbelievable ease, you see? And you can do it with a full potential. So that will be restored to the Jewish people, which is interesting. In any case, now, the exile, the nations that exiled the Jews, just to mention them, there are 8 of them. And these are they. There's Egypt, which is the first exile. The second one is Babylon, Bavel, which of course destroyed the temple. The third one was Persia, which of course is Achashverosh, it's Porus. The fourth one was Yavan, Greece, which of course is the whole story of Hanukkah. And the fifth one is Rome, which of course destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash. And also we have been in the exile of Rome for the last 2,000 years. Now in the end of time, you will have, so those are 5 kingdoms that will subjugate the Jews. In the end of time, which we are now in, there will be an additional 3. And they are Ishmael, which is the Muslims. The second one is Amalek, the Amalekites. And the third one will be the Erev Rav. And the Erev Rav, as I mentioned many times, are really Jews that want to cancel or negate or erase the bond that the Jews have with God, the covenant, the agreement, and supplant it with culture, Jewish culture, or whatever. They want to remove the uniqueness that the Jewish people have with God and just make them a regular nation, but with a unique culture, you see. That's the Erev Rav. Any case, those are the 8 what's called Shibudim, Shibud Malchus. Those are basically there are 4 of them, and that's Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. You see. In any case, these are the 8 nations of the world that will subjugate the Jews and bring them into, of course, Golus. Now, just take a short look. They're really described in the Torah, because the Torah refers in the beginning, or in Bereshis, it says, V'ha'oretz hoyisa, and God, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'oretz, God created the heavens and the earth, right? And then it says, V'ha'oretz hoyisa soihu, it was unformed, voyu is void, is empty, choshech is darkness, and tahoim is the abyss, is the deep sea. So the Medrash says that these four terms refer actually to the exiles, the four exiles, the main exiles. Babylon is Tohu, Persia is Vohu, and Choshech is Rome, is Greece, and Tahoim, the abyss, is Rome. And it's worthwhile just taking a look, at least superficially, what exactly is the essential nature of these exiles that perform such a tremendous job of an impediment and an obstacle to the Jewish people. Well, the first one is basically a mixture of good and evil in the same environment. And because of that, it evokes an enormous amount of confusion. This is Babylon, because Babylon had tremendous amount of avodah zarah, worshipping of idols, which in many ways is spiritual. Obviously, it's just the wrong kind of spirituality. But they did believe in deities. So it's a mixture of spirituality together with the wrong kind of spirituality. Then the second one, which is Persia. Persia was a very physically dominant country. It was basically just bad. There's no real spirituality in Persia, you see. And the third one was Greece. And Greece presented a tremendous obstacle, and that is an alternative understanding of reality devoid of spirituality. In other words, they actually had a system of reality that would explain everything. It wasn't merely evil, it was an entire justification and a system, intellectual system, which was devoid of spirituality. This is Greek philosophy and Greek science. Now, the obstacle of Rome is that the dogma or the doctrine of or the beliefs of Greece was now spread throughout the entire world. And that's what Rome really did. They took the culture of Greece and they made it the dominant culture throughout the entire world. That's what they did. That's Rome. So these then would be the impediments or the obstacles that would present themselves if you were in that particular exile or golus. Now, what I want to focus on, however, is the concept we know that Rome was one of the major exiles of the Jewish people. In fact, it is the greatest of all the exiles. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look who Rome really is. Everything starts from Esav. Esav, who's the brother of Yaakov, is, of course, failed. And I mentioned a long time ago that he was really supposed to be a patriarch, an Ov, but he failed. In any case, so Esav's job now became somebody to persecute Yaakov. In other words, if Yaakov was doing a sin, then Esav would persecute him in the sense of an exile, you see. So Esav is the fourth exile, you see, which was the longest of all the exiles. And I'm skipping a lot of ideas, because I had mentioned that previously. Now Esav became Edom. And Edom, of course, is the Edomites. You see, Edom, of course, is the Edomites. And Esav became a nation called Edom. Then Edom became Rome. The Torah says that Esav became Edom, and the Gemara says that Edom became Rome. And Rome, of course, is an exile of which we have been under for 2,000 years. Even though the Roman Empire disappeared. Because Rome was changed, it was transformed as an exile really into Christianity. And what Christianity did is it took over the exile over the Jews of Rome, and you could see that because Christianity and Rome are so intertwined. Anybody goes to Italy and looks at the Vatican, you see all kinds of Roman artifacts and effects and so on, But Rome became, instead of a nation that would exile the Jews, it would become a religion, Christianity. And of course we know that the Christians, a tremendous majority of them, have created an enormous amount of death and destruction to the Jewish people for 2,000 years, you see. Now, Christianity today is represented really by Western civilization. And Western civilization, which is basically Christian, has taken over the exile of Christianity, you see. Now, it's interesting to note that Esau had three characteristics. One characteristic is that he was an incredibly arrogant person, you see. Vayives Esav es habechora, and Esau despised the firstborn right. Esau was an unbelievable, arrogant individual, haughty, and so on. The second characteristic of Esau is that he's a fraud, he's an imposter, he's a fake. He made believe that he was righteous, but meanwhile, he was an incredibly evil person who committed terrible sins, of which the Torah mentions and so on, you see. So that's the second characteristic of Esau. And the third characteristic of Esau is he was a tremendous Baal Taiva. He was a tremendous pleasure-seeking individual. Hedonism, you see. So because of that, Western civilization represents Esau, as I mentioned, has these three characteristics. The characteristics of the arrogance of Esau is represented by Russia, the Soviet Union, that for so many years they were atheists, and therefore what they of course believed in themselves, man's dominance over God, or man's dominance totally. They didn't believe in God, it was atheistic. So the arrogance of Esau is represented by Russia in the form of the Soviet Union. Because before that, Russia was the Russian Orthodox Church, you see, and that is, of course, is one of the segments of Christianity. So the arrogance of Esau is communism. The second idea, which is the mirma, the fraud, is represented by Europe. Because Europe professes to be righteous, okay, but Europe has killed more Jews than maybe all the exiles put together, which is, when you think about that, is incredible. Christianity is responsible for the death of hundreds of millions of people over the 2,000 years, you see. So therefore, and it's fraudulent. Why? Because they're supposed to be righteous. They say, turn the other cheek. Meanwhile, it's your cheek that they turn, you see. And they have destroyed so many different nations and cultures and so on. And the third area of Esau, or characteristic of Esau, is taiva, is pleasure. And the nation that represents the taiva of Esau, which by the way is the mildest form of Esau, is America. America is a land that is tremendously into this world, olam hazeh, materialism, pleasure. You see, that's what they're into. So there you have it. You have the three characteristics of Esau represented by the three different sections of Western civilization. And therefore, these are the exiles that the Jews have to go through. All of these exiles. And all of them offer terrible impediments, obstacles, and the Jews struggle mightily in order to overcome this, because that's in many ways a stage 3 avodah, you see, where you have to struggle against the zoyama, you see, in order to become righteous and God-fearing. Now, what's interesting is this. If you take Rome, Rome is called the evil of Esau. That's really what it was. You know, Rome dominated the entire world and committed terrible acts of destruction and death and so on, you see. But there was a Roman emperor who ruled, I think, from 160 CE to about 180 or 185 CE. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. And he actually wrote a book called The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He's a bright guy. He was a thinker, you see. But Marcus Aurelius Antoninus was unusual. There was a certain amount of time that he went to Tiberias. And there he met Rabbi, Rabbeinu HaKodesh, the great Rabbi who wrote the Mishnayos, who was among the greatest of the Tanoim, those people who wrote the Mishnah. In fact, Rabbi did write the Mishnah. What was unusual about Marcus Aurelius is that he really loved Rabbi. I mean, there's a story in the Gemara that says that Rabbi once didn't feel well. Marcus Aurelius, and he wanted to get onto his bed. So Marcus Aurelius said to him, well, let me help you get on the bed. You know, apparently the bed was high. So Marcus Aurelius said, I'll bend down, you'll put your foot on top of my back, and from that, I will serve as a pedestal for you to get into your bed. So Rabbi was stunned. He says, am I going to use the emperor of the Roman Empire as a footstool? You see? And Marcus Aurelius answered, he says, better to be your footstool, you know, here, and then to be that in the future world. Marcus Aurelius loved Rabbi, which is incredible. So therefore, Marcus Aurelius already what's called the Toiv Shebe-Esav, the good part of Esav. Why? Because he understood the incredible value of the Jews and the incredible value of the Torah itself. In fact, it's related in the Gemara that Marcus Aurelius wanted to help the scholars, the Talmidei Chachomim of Tiberias, to learn Torah. And so he removed the tax that the Romans had placed on many people. And as a result of that, people were able to learn Torah. Could you imagine what Marcus Aurelius did? Is that he allowed the Jewish people to learn their Torah. He actually promoted it and fostered it. It's incredible. The second thing Marcus Aurelius did was even greater, because Rabbi knew there was a tremendous problem. The Jews were now going to go into exile, real exile. At least until now they were in Israel. But now they were going to spread out to all the lands of the earth. But the problem is that the Torah, especially the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the oral law, had no standard text. Each person who would learn and then teach it to his students used his own wording to describe the oral law. And Rabbi realized that this will never go in the exile. The real exile, where everybody is now spread out throughout the world. You need a standardized text, you see? So what Rabbi was able to do, and it's because of Marcus Aurelius, is what? Is that he was able to remove the persecution of the Jews. So it comes out that in his time, about 20 or 25 years, there was an incredible peace that he was able to foster for the Jewish people. And because of that, Rabbi was able to hold a convention of all these Tanoim and bring them down, and they would repeat their learnings. And Rabbi was able to standardize all the Torah Sheba'al Peh in a uniform text called the Mishnah. And because of that, the Jews now had a standardized text called the Mishnah, and they would take it with them through the exile. So it comes out that Marcus Aurelius not only helped Jewish scholars learn, promoted the Torah, but he actually was responsible for the kiyum, for the fact that the Torah Sheba'al Peh was able to last, endure, in the exile of the Jewish people. You talk about a Toiv Shebe-Esav. That's who he was, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. And that really is the beginning of the Toiv Shebe-Esav, you see. In any case, so we now have an understanding of the concepts of what Golus is, the nations that exile the Jews, the nations that we have been in exile, the problem with exile, that we are exiled from our own potential in many ways, and so on. And we see Rome, Esav, Christianity, Western civilization, as the last embodiment of Esav. You see, now, I had mentioned many times the concept of Tov Esav, and I have now given you the origin of that concept. That Esav, in the end, I mentioned a long time ago, many times, that in the end, Esav does tshuva. He repents because he wanted to repent. When he met Yaakov, he told him, Yehi Lucha Sheloch. When Yaakov returned from Lavan, Esav met him, and he said, Yehi Lucha Sheloch, let that which is yours be yours. You see, and Rashi says what that means is that he said that the blessings are yours, the land of Israel is yours, it's all yours. Well, what does that mean? He's coming to kill Yaakov with 400 men, and he now recants, he now changes his mind. And the answer is because Esav was literally at the doorstep of doing tshuva. Unfortunately, Yaakov did not recognize that, without getting into that. I've explored that many times in previous lectures. Okay? So therefore, Esav never did tshuva, and he went back to his path of evil. So God said that because he wanted to do tshuva, and Yaakov missed the opportunity, in the end, you will do tshuva. You will repent. And that repentance will be Tov Esav, the good part of Esav. And you will assist Yaakov to do the tikkun, to do the rectification of creation. But this will be before the Mashiach comes. And therefore you will get tremendous credit for what you have done. You see. Therefore, what we see therefore is that in many ways the beginning of the Tov Esav is this concept of Marcus Aurelius, who was the emperor of Rome. You see. In any case, so these are the ideas so far. Now, today is July 8th, actually tomorrow is July 9th, which I said is Shiva Asar Tammuz, is the 17th day of Tammuz. Okay. Now, what is interesting about that day, besides the Jewish catastrophes, is something that has occurred on that day, which I want to mention, and most people are not aware of this. The Declaration of Independence, when was it signed? It was signed on July 4th, 1776. Do you know that that day was Shiva Asar Tammuz? That's right. July 4th, 1776 was Independence Day. That was signed, the Declaration of Independence was signed by all 56 people, if I remember correctly the number, okay? It was signed then on July 4th, right? But that day in the Hebrew calendar is Yud Zayin Tammuz, Shiva Asar Tammuz. That's amazing. Why would that happen? Why would America rise? And that's obviously the beginning, that's the birthday of America. Why would that happen on July 4th? Why would that happen on Shiva Asar Tammuz? You see. And the answer is something which is very strange. You see. This is the beginning, really, of the Tov Esav. Because America is the least harsh of all the nations that subjugated the Jews. Just amazing. You take a look at Russia, they slaughtered the Jews. You take a look at Europe, they slaughtered the Jews. America has been a nation that has allowed the Jews to learn Torah, to practice their religion. In fact, they have allowed all nations to practice their religion. That's enshrined in what? In the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion. You see? Therefore, America is the Tov Esav. It's a good part of Esav that's doing tshuva. You see? And therefore, they have enabled Jewish people to tremendously grow and excel in Torah wisdom and in Judaism, in the tikkun process, the rectification process itself. So, in a certain sense, but the question is why? And if you remember that the Chazal say that the Mashiach ben David will come on Tisha B'Av, which is interesting. Now, what does that mean? That it seems to mean that that day will be changed from a day of Churban, of destruction, of terrible mourning by the Jewish people. That day will become a day of unbelievable glory and thanksgiving, because the redemption will begin on Tisha B'Av. So what is interesting is the same idea is not only Tisha B'Av, is also Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. You see, that the day of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, which is a day of terrible destruction of the Jewish people, when the walls were breached in the temple, in the second temple, and so on, that day will be the founding of Esav, the good part of Esav, you see. And in a certain sense, the good part of Esav means that is the beginning of Esav doing tshuva, of repenting. Yes, in a certain sense, one can almost consider this as the beginning of redemption. I know it's interesting, it's hard to believe, but when Esav does tshuva, when the Jews can now go to a country where they can learn Torah and be righteous and observe their religion, you see, that itself is a beginning, is a redemptive concept. And that is the day that the Tov Sheba Esav, the good part of Esav, is created, you see. So in a certain sense, July 4th, or rather I should say Yud Zayin Tammuz, right, is the beginning of a Messianic era, or the precursor to a Messianic era, because it allows the America to grow, which is the Tov Sheba Esav, the good part of Esav, where the Jews will be able to reach tremendous heights in Judaism and learning Torah. That's really what it meant, because America has always been an incredible country that respects religion and so many other freedoms that we have. But what it does for Judaism is allows Judaism to prosper and flourish and to become, of course, do the tikkun process. That's Messianic. So look how much America is tied, interestingly enough, to the Messianic process. Because even though it's an exile, America's an exile, but it's what's called a gentle exile, you see. It's gentle. Because Jews can do whatever they want, prosperity and so on, flourish with total freedom. That's why America is really the greatest country that has ever existed, you know, in terms of the non-Jews and so on. So in that sense, July 4th, which was Yud Zayin Tammuz, thus it's of course the 17th day of Tammuz, in many ways is a beginning of the Geula, because it's the beginning of the Tov Sheba Esav. The old guy Marcus Aurelius, who really was the beginning of Tov Sheba Esav, now the country of America, you see, now it has its origin in the 17th day of Tammuz, you see. And therefore, that is also one of the reasons why God is so good to America. You have to realize that America has tremendous amount of divine providence, divine assistance. You know, it's funny, I once mentioned even the Civil War. Why did the Civil War happen? Because America was responsible, even though they didn't capture the black slaves, the African slaves in that, but they bought them and they held them. You know, if you take somebody who's kidnapped, right, and you buy the kidnapped person from him, right, you're also a kidnapper. It's the same thing, even if you didn't originate the kidnapping process. So therefore, America was guilty of death, because the einish, the punishment of kidnapping, is death. So could you imagine when America was a slave country, a country that owned slaves? Therefore, America had tremendous claim against it in heaven, that they're all liable to the death penalty. Therefore, you have a civil war, which God did on purpose, is to remove the culpability and that death sentence that would hold over America. But besides that, America is tremendously prosperous. Whatever America does touches the gold. It's a very unusual country. In fact, America is the greatest country on earth, and it's probably the greatest country to ever be on earth. I mean, just look at the prosperity of the average person. You know, I'm not talking about now with COVID-19, But just look at the prosperity of people. The average American has more property, more wherewithal to enjoy life than the Emperor of Rome. Think about that. That's incredible. And that is the reward of a nation that is a Tov Shebe'esav. That is a good part of Esav, especially that America allows the Jewish people to do the tikkun process. There's also something else. 1776, which is interesting. Now we know that creation was made in 6 days. 6 days. Why? Right? And therefore, the Gemara says that the world will last 6,000 years. Each day in the creation calendar, so to speak, is equivalent to 1,000 years, because it says, David HaMelech says, until 1,000 years, one day in your eyes is like 1,000 years in ours. So therefore, you can compare the creation calendar, which will last 6,000 years, right, to the civil calendar. Okay, and if you'll notice, based on that calendar, that there are many things that happen. For instance, the year 1240 CE, okay, is equivalent to the year, it's 5 days, so it's equivalent to the year 5,000. But how many days is that? It's 5 days. So that's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. That means the year 1240, which is the year 5,000, which is the 6th day of creation, right, is Erev Shabbos, it's Friday. And that's one of the reasons which I mentioned a long time ago, that the Messianic light begins to come down. Well, what's another significant at that time? What's another significant time period is 1740. 1740, right, is equivalent to 5,500, which on the creation clock or calendar is equivalent to 6 a.m. Friday morning. And that's the last day, so to speak, of the world. It's Friday morning, and which begins Friday, Erev Shabbos. That's the beginning of the last day of this world, Olam Hazeh, because this world will only last for 6,000 years, which is exactly 6 days. Now, therefore, 1740 is equivalent to 6 a.m. Friday morning. But that's dawn, you see. So if you think about it, a couple of years later, 1776, at the beginning of the dawn, is a fundamental time of redemption also, because it's the dawn of Friday morning, which is the beginning of the last day of creation. Therefore, America is founded in 1776, you see, which is the year 5,536, you see, which is right after the beginning of dawn on Friday morning, because that really accelerates and intensifies the Messianic process. But you'll notice other things happening also, is that since you had the dawn at 1740, and then after, the klipa, or the golus of the Jews, even in Europe, also started changing, you see, because what happened was you had the French Revolution, you had Napoleon, which spread across Europe. The greatest antidote, by the way, to the Jewish persecution is democracy. Because what enabled a great deal of persecution of the Jews is monarchies, you see, kings that were incredibly evil. But what democracy does is it puts the power of a government not in the hands of a monarch, but it puts it in the hands of the people. And that means that it's more difficult for many, many people to exercise a tyranny, much more difficult. So therefore, at the beginning of the Friday morning, which is 1740, and so on and onwards, the exiles became easier for the Jews, you see. In America, it was the foundation, the creation of America, Tov Shebe'esav, good part of Esav. And even in Europe, you had the French Revolution, which began to, of course, promote democracy, the rule of the people. And that was the Enlightenment, the Reformation, the Renaissance, whatever you want to call it, and so on, you see? So there are many things that took place at that time. But what I'm bringing out is, what's amazing is that 1776, July 4th, is Yud Zayin Tammuz. So therefore the 17th day of Tammuz itself promotes or brings into creation the Tov Shebeisav, you see. And now, as a result of that, we can now understand something which is very important, you see. And that's Reb Chaim Volozhin. Why does Reb Chaim Volozhin say that the last Golus is America? Because Reb Chaim Volozhin realized that in the end, the exiles will get easier to bear. And not only that, but the last exile will be the Tov Shebeisav, will be the good part of Esav. So not only, even though it's an exile, in the sense that we are not in our country, but it will be much easier to bear, but more important, they will actually assist or allow the Jewish people to pursue Judaism, you see. And that's why that's the last exile. Because their job in terms of America, and of course America will influence a great part of the world, now the job is to help the Jews do the tikkun, you see, and therefore they are the last exile. Because their job is no longer to make the Jews suffer, but on the contrary, it's to enable the Jews to do the tikkun. So that's what Reb Chaim Volozhin means, that it is the last exile, you see, because it's the Tov Shebeisav, the good part of Esav, that allows the tikkun process to continue. Because like I say, the Jews are able to learn Torah, they're able to practice their religion with complete freedom. Now, when we think about that, we begin to look and ask, okay, so America is an exile, obviously, it's a good exile, and so on. But remember, it's an exile. It has to end. The Jewish presence in America must end, you see. Where do we see that? Because God says in Nitzavim, right, that even if your outcasts are at the ends of the heaven, from there I will gather you, and from there, right, I will take you to me. What does that mean? That means there's a divine decree or prophecy that in the end of time, all the Jews will leave, the exiles, and they will come back to God, they will be rehabilitated, and they will all come back to Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, that's what it means. Now we can ask ourselves, that's interesting, how does the American exile end? Well, what is happening now in many ways, and that's what I wanted to talk about also, what is happening now is just incredible to watch. And what I want to offer you is that there are different scenarios, possibilities of how the American exile can end. And I want to offer you two. And both of them are possible now. I want to show you how. Normally, how does an exile end? They're persecuted. You see, they become tremendously threatened in that country, tremendous violence, and they're expelled. This is what happens most of the time. And there's a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism. If you look at all the exiles where the Jews were thrown out of one country and went to the other. I mean, the classic is Spain, 1492, where they threw all the Jews out, you see. So they were expelled. They were threatened, of course. They were expelled. And that ended the Spanish exile. And then other exiles began when the Jews moved eastward, across Europe and so on, you see. But that's usually how it enters, you see, where there's a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, you see, there's violence, there's threats, there's expulsions. That's usually how it ends and so on. So therefore the Jews have to run away, they have to flee. But what winds up is they flee to another exile. What is interesting is that is one method of removing the Jews from one exile and to go back to another country or to go to another exile, you see. But remember, this is the last exile. America, Europe, these are the last exiles, and certainly America. You know, what would happen in America? Is this possible to happen? where America can expel the Jews or threaten the Jews, that there could be a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism or in anti-Israel and so on? And the answer is yes. We're watching it now. Let's take a look, okay? There are two people running for the presidency. One is Joe Biden and the other is Donald Trump, who's trying to get reelected. Imagine Joe Biden. Imagine if Joe Biden wins the presidency this November 3rd, okay? What does that mean? That will be catastrophic for America and catastrophic for the Jewish people. Why? Fundamentally, the greatest enemy of America, if you think about that, is those people who want to overthrow America. They want to make America socialist, you see. That's what they want to do. They want to increase the bureaucracy, the regulations, big government, big tax, make it socialist and so on. And with that always comes a rise of anti-Semitism, and certainly anti-Israel, you see. But if Joe Biden becomes president, right, the incredible thing is that he is cognitively challenged. He's almost senile. It's the beginning of dementia. So what that means is that he may be a president, but he's going to be a puppet, where other people will be able to control him. Who? All those people that want to overthrow America, the Antifa. You see, so it's actually possible for America to change radically if Joe Biden becomes president. Because since he is cognitively challenged, he's beginning dementia, he will follow the left, the radical left, the liberals. See, they will take control of him. They will tell him what to do. You see, the Democrats, all of them will tell him what to do, and that will be the beginning of the end of America. But if that happens, there will be a tremendous rise. Not only will the American economy suffer, but there will be a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism. And then you're going to see a mass exit of the Jewish people and perhaps other people, but certainly the Jews. Therefore, we realize something is very interesting. The pandemic. The pandemic can actually, in a certain sense, may be there to allow Joe Biden to become the president. How? Because what the pandemic has done, it has erased the achievements of Donald Trump. And we know that. The economy is spinning out of control, right? Nobody can go out. People are suffering. They're dying, right? The whole country, in many ways, is suffering terribly, right? The pandemic. And what the pandemic is doing is allowing the achievements of Trump to be erased. So that's very bad for Trump's re-election campaign, you see. The second thing is the racial riots that happened because of the murder of George Floyd, which is unfortunate, and so on. But that has allowed the people who want to rebel and overthrow America, make it into a socialist, communist country, because that's basically who they are, the Antifa, they're trained communists by their own admission, right? That allows them to express their dominance and try to take over America, which also is against Trump, you see, because it empowers the liberal left, the Democrats, or the radical left, the liberals, and so on. So it comes out that, are we looking at something very strange? Is the reason why God allowed the pandemic to happen because he wants to erase the achievements of Trump? Trump has done what he has to do, which has enabled Israel to achieve tremendous successes. Jerusalem is the capital, right? And the Golan, and the embassies moved, and so on. And there's a tremendous amount of things that Trump has done. Besides that, he has curbed the Arabs and so on, without going into all what he's done, you know. Is the reason for the pandemic, now that, is the job of Trump finished? And therefore the pandemic now erases his achievements, and therefore makes it possible, because now people are not having what they had economically. So therefore that puts Trump at a tremendous disadvantage. And is the reason why the racial riots have occurred in order to empower the peoples who want to overthrow America? But that would mean, if that was true, if Joe Biden wins, he will be taken over by the liberal left. And what that means is that's the beginning of the end of America, obviously. And therefore the Jews realize that. I mean, they want to defund the police. How insane can anybody be? I mean, if you have a complaint, fine. So you could retrain the police or in some way improve. Of course you can improve it. Everybody's willing to do that. But how could you defund them? That doesn't make any sense. You know, who are you going to call if somebody's robbing your house or threatening your family? Who are you going to call, a social worker? I mean, the whole thing is insane. But of course the whole reason is to overthrow America, you see? But this is all being, and in fact, Biden even said today that he wants to take money away from the police department. I mean, look at what's happening. He's being completely influenced, you know, by the liberal left, by the Democrats. So you're watching the end of America, basically. So we ask ourselves, is that why this is happening now before Trump gets elected? Because God wants to now terminate his job, chase the Jews out of America, and let them all go to Israel? Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting scenario. That would certainly indicate the end of the Jewish allegiance and residency in America. And that would end the Golus. But I think not. I think the reason for this, really, is not to empower these people, but to destroy the Democratic Party. How? Because what the pandemic has done, especially the racial riots, it has allowed America to observe what liberal Democrats do when they're mayors and they're governors, what they do when they're in political power. Everybody realizes this is insane. There is no safety and security now in America, you see. So if that's the case, how can you vote for these people? And it's not only that, they want to put in a Green Deal, which they say will cost $94 trillion over 10 years. That's insane. No oil, no gas, no coal. It's almost like, what has happened to these people, the Democrats? So it could be that what God has done, right, is to ensure the election for Trump by showing that if Democrats get in, if Biden gets in and he's now controlled by the left and the liberals and all that, and the Antifa and so on, this is what you're going to get. So what that may mean is that the silent majority of America, which sees what's going on and realizes that if you don't have safety and security, that's the end of America. I'm not even talking about their crazy economic policies. And therefore the American people will en masse go out and vote for Trump. And that will enable Trump to continue doing, because there's more to be done, what he has to do, you see. But if that happens, then clearly, how then will the American exile end? And the answer is really, you have to look at Egypt. Because in many ways, Egypt is the model of the redemption itself. Egypt is about the Mashiach himself, Mashiach ben Yosef, Moshe Rabbeinu, coming to the country of Egypt, where the Jews were, and taking them out. And that's the end of it. So that scenario really, in many ways, means something different. It means that the Mashiach ben Yosef, whoever he is, will be released from whatever impediments tie him down, and so on. And he will grow to be an awesome spiritual individual. We're talking about a Mashiach ben Yosef. And he will come and he will be in America, because that's really basically where he is in America. Because we see from the Gemara that it says that the Mashiach ben David is a Pischei Roimi, stands at the gates of Rome. And we know Rome today is America. Why? Because the Mashiach is always resides and is actually born into the country that he overthrows. You see, just like Moshe Rabbeinu was born in Egypt, and he was raised in the house of Parai, because that was the very place that he would overthrow. So Mashiach himself is probably born in America, because he's the one that in many ways takes the Jews out of America. You see? So that's a second scenario where God has allowed the racial riots and the pandemic to occur in order for the Democrats to reveal their insanities, their crazy economic policies, you see. And not only that, but the way they govern, where there's an incredible rate of enormous crime, murder, stealing, theft, arson, that's going on in many American cities. And they're doing nothing. So therefore, what he wants is in the coming election is Trump wins, but more than Trump wins, is that the Democratic Party are really, in many ways, decimated. So it's interesting. The answer to that question leads us in two different directions. Either it guarantees the election of Trump in a landslide victory for Trump, or it initiates Biden, his Antifa, all the left that want to destroy America, you see, and therefore that is the beginning of the American exile. So either the American exile ends with America itself changing from the Tov Shebe'esav, the good part of Esav, back to the Ra Shebe'esav, the evil of Esav, because apparently Trump's job will have been done, and now Israel can grow further and further on its own. So that's one possibility, and that's why what's happening now happens before the election. Or it could mean the end of the Democratic Party, or certainly the slaughter or the landslide against the Democrats, and that continues. And if the way the American exile happens is that the Mashiach ben Yosef changes the consciousness of the Jewish people, which he's able to do, because the Mashiach ben Yosef will receive an aspect of the neshama of Adam Harishon, which is called the Yechidah. And that is that aspect of the soul that allows you to experience God, the Shekhinah itself. And since Adam Harishon had that aspect of the neshama called the Yechidah of all people, all Jewish people, and the Mashiach ben Yosef gets at least half of it, because Mashiach ben David gets the other half, then he will change the consciousness of the Jewish people, you see. And all of a sudden the Jews will realize what the truth is, and they will be rehabilitated and begin the process. And the Jews will leave America for the simple reason that everything's different. Now God is back. Mashiach ben Yosef, the redemption has started. Mashiach ben Yosef will build the Beis HaMikdash, which I had mentioned previously, and that's why the Jews will leave. Well, what's the thing that we have to look for? November 3rd. That will tell us which way the American exile will end. Of course, I believe that we're looking here at a tremendous landslide victory for Trump, and the way it will end is in a good way, in the sense that the Jews will not run from America because of the terrible catastrophe of the election of Joe Biden, but they'll run to Eretz Yisrael for the simple reason that Mashiach ben Yosef is here. He has changed the consciousness of the Jewish people, and that is the beginning of the redemption, where the Jews will be the greatest nation on earth. And all peoples will realize that. And like it says in the Navi, the 10 non-Jews will grab onto the cloak of a Jew and say to him, "Take us with you, because we have heard that God is with you." That anyway will happen. So that's why I've tried to explore what is happening. It's happening now. It can go either way. Scenario 1 or scenario 2. This is no longer theoretical, by the way. It's happening now, which means that America is actually it's possible for scenario 1 to occur, where Joe Biden becomes president. That's basically the end of America as we know it, be a drastically different country. That means the establishment, the left, the Democrats, will have achieved the reestablishment of the Ra Shebe'esav, and therefore that will drive the Jews out. Well, let's wait and see what happens this November. Thank you.